Yeah, I was going to. Good morning. This is Cynthia Hutchison with Automation Alley. Thank you for joining us today. I want to welcome a very special guest today. We have U.S. Congresswoman Haley Stevens with us. Welcome, Haley.
Good morning. Thank you so much.
I'll do more of an intro for you. As Michigan's Industry 4.0 Knowledge Center and the World Economic Forum's Advanced Manufacturing Hub for North America, we are especially excited to have Haley with us because she has a background in STEM. She's got a background in manufacturing. She's a little bit of all things that we get excited about here at Automation Alley. So her history includes that she sits on the House Committee on Education and Labor, as well as on the Committee of Science, Space, and Technology, where she's the chairwoman of Research and Technology. So those things combine together to give Michigan a great advantage to have somebody with this kind of background propelling our visions and our mission. So welcome. You want to do a brief intro?
Absolutely. I'll just say one of my big passions and motivators for being in Congress, Cynthia, is the work of Automation Alley and what you represent for Southeastern Michigan, and frankly, what you represent for the world with Industry 4.0 and the drivers of our automotive industry, aerospace, other things that connect in to Industry 4.0. Not only do you have the thought leadership, but you have the connectivity and technical resources that are supporting our manufacturing ecosystem to advance, to grow, and to lead in this space. So I couldn't be more excited to be with you all here today. My role on the House Science Committee for Research and Technology, I'm the chair of that division, and it's a real honor to, as they say, hold the gavel on behalf of our district. You all are located in my district in Troy, and you're just a part of our vibrancy. And I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to exchange with you and have the partnership that we do. I frankly, Cynthia, could not have imagined this first term in Congress without all of you and your members at Automation Alley and the students who you continue to bring in. I know you do so much with technical education, supporting the partners. One time I was over at Automation Alley and you had all the educators there, and that's exactly what's going to push us to the forefront.
Thank you. It's that collaboration. It's that cross-industry collaboration, cross-cultural collaboration. It's bringing the academics with the social improvement areas and all together into one place. It's exciting. I want to talk to you about COVID. And so one of the things we're doing now is talking about how Industry 4.0 is going to, how is it going to help us come out of COVID perhaps faster than we would have without it? And what kind of strategies, how has this changed our ability to adopt technology? Does the COVID-19 impact the willingness of manufacturing to look at technology as a driver?
Yeah, I think COVID-19 has obviously been a pretty enormous event. It's, to say the least, right? This is a global pandemic. It's changed the way society has functioned temporarily. It's implemented a new type of bio-threat into the atmosphere. It's shuttered our schools. It's changed our economy. But through the lens of what you're asking this question, as it pertains to the work of Automation Alley and frankly, the work of so many Michiganders, what does this mean for technology? Well, I think COVID-19 has been a wake-up call with technological advancements and open source platforms and supply chain capabilities, right? Supply chain recovery efforts, supply chain reworking efforts. And when you look at what happened in the early weeks of the pandemic, when the WHO, the World Health Organization, declared we were in a pandemic, you saw our supply chain going every which way, right? How do we source the personal protective equipment? How do we start making that? Who is the left hand talking to the right hand? Is it talking to the next person's left and right hand in the proper way? And there was a lot of reflection around that. And one thing we know is that IoT is projected to be a nearly $6.5 trillion industry segment. I've personally done a lot of work in this space around getting our smaller, more, mom and pop type shops up to speed with digital manufacturing opportunities, with Wi-Fi monitorization, the adaptation of sensors. And now we see more than ever how and why we need to modernize. And look, I could speak about this for a long time, but I think one of the most important things to remember is that even though we'll have digital adaptations, just like we have the computer, right? I've been on the computer almost all my life, right? Using it as a resource in school and now as a professional, but I still like to handwrite things. I still use a date book. And so it's not to say that the digital supersedes the analog to the point that we have to get rid of the analog. And I think that's so important for a lot of our manufacturers to understand, is that we need you to be digital ready for when the supply chain is moving in that way, when your customers are moving in that way, when your OEM is certainly demanding that. But it's also not to say that you can't have the analog as well. And this is something we've seen in studies. We've seen this proven out, that we can have both and still succeed, but we need to have both.
Thank you. And, so you brought up a couple of things that I love how I prepare questions for you, and we're going to go off script completely. My writers will be crazy, but one of the things is, my passion, like yours, I've had a passion about the supply chain for quite some time, and a concern about our small to mid-sized companies. And that's our role at Automation Alley, is to keep those companies as competitive as anybody in the world so that they can force that upstream supply chain. What we see is the OEMs and then the tier ones prepared. And even those aren't totally prepared for digitization. We see a preparedness that is ahead of that of their smaller peers. One of the things that I'm seeing with the COVID presentation is that because it's impacted everybody equally, including those huge companies, some of the smaller companies, there's almost a democratization of resolution. Some of the smaller companies have reached out to small startup vendors to say, how can you help us become more ready for a return to work? So we're seeing small tech companies move into a space they weren't in before. We're seeing all kinds of manufacturing facilities look at things they weren't able to before. And I hope that the net is a strengthening of the supply chain with, as you call, a recognition of that wake-up call. So one of the things that we look at along that continuum becomes, you've got a really strong technical background, open source and data sharing. And now that we go into tracking and tracing, what does happen to the data? That's a concern for me.
Right. Yeah. And that's a concern from the standpoint of, are we doing it right? Are we doing it successfully? And are we also protecting privacy in the process? And some of these are cultural reactions. Certainly the testing and tracing was done really well in the early stages in South Korea, but some might claim, a civil liberties violation. They might claim that that went too far. I think for us, it comes down to the applications that we're using and the trust arrangement that we're entering into, and that, if you want to go and visit this venue or attend this event, hey, you're going to be subject to the testing and tracing, and it's a disclaimer. It's a waiver, just like we, have seen in, other instances, like when you're downloading a mobile application. And then obviously the potential for a lot of these IoT applications that we've lightly touched on. This is an opportunity for the proliferation of American-made, advanced and adopted technologies to proliferate and be used for good. You have to remember, the reason why we want to do testing and tracing, testing is so essential to us, right? Is that we want to use that testing and tracing to save lives, to prevent the next outbreak, and to make sure that we're doing it right by coming back to work. We know that some people want to come back to work. Some people want to continue to see this play out. We need some form of transparency. And I think having healthy transparency that does not manipulate or misuse data is really one of the great outcomes to come from this solution making that we are identifying to combat COVID-19. This is the way in which we've got to evolve and got to find a way to operate as not only as a society and as a country, but again, as the world leader, as the leader of the free world. And frankly, I look at places again like Automation Alley who've been on the forefront of this, and certainly we can look at the testing and tracing and connect it back to other manufacturing components and what we need for PPE and other great things for data gathering. But we're going to be the leaders here. We know we are.
Thank you. We feel that too. So when we talk about, one of the things we talk about a lot with our Industry 4.0 conversations, we consistently have conversations about standards. So with Industry 4.0, whether it's 3D printing or data storage and who owns that data that we just referenced, or 5G as an enabler, is there a standard making, up until now, we haven't really seen anybody jump into an Industry 4.0 broad standard or even narrow within each of those disciplines. Is that something that federal and or state politics should be getting involved in and helping us develop a path forward?
Yeah, there's a lot of caution and opportunity with the creation of a standard. As I had mentioned, I'm the chair of the subcommittee on House Science, Space, and Technology for Research and Technology. And the purview of that is for the National Science Foundation. And in this case, it's very important. It's for the National Institute of Standards and Technologies. That's my direct purview as a subcommittee chair. And as somebody who's had the privilege of spending almost my entire career working with this preeminent national standards institute, it's just a preeminent institute and standards body for the country. I think they're going to play very heavily for us in the creation of standards. And it's very, very important for us. And we saw this play out in some of the early stages of the arrival of the pandemic, which is who's calling the shots, how are they calling the shots, and how are they being implemented? I caution everybody that standards take a lot of time. They are not done overnight, that you need to go through the process of formulating standards first and foremost. Now, trying to develop standards in the age of COVID-19 is also quite complicated because COVID-19, right, it's a known disease. We know it exists, but we don't know everything about it. It is still a novel virus. So the rush to do standards when we don't have all the scientific data and evidence about the disease itself, and therefore what it does to our workplaces, our manufacturing sector, even some of the things that we want to manufacture to respond to COVID-19. Now you're seeing a lot of great things being manufactured and done. You've seen Michigan step up to that industrial call to action. When our big three had to shutter and we started producing the ventilators and sourcing other personal protective equipment and making that and sourcing masks, and even some of our distilleries stepping up and making the hand sanitizer. And there was a real approach that was not cumbersome, that still had safety, and still put into place the right measures so that these goods could be produced. But we did it in such a way that allowed us to be efficient and expedient. I think for the long term, what we want to do is we don't want to create a series of competing standards. We don't want standards at the state level and the county level competing with the standards at the federal level. As a Congresswoman, I've got a lot of preference for the federal standards, right? And we're not talking about regulations here. We're talking about standards that unlock innovations, that allow our manufacturers to produce, right? And so I think it's very important to rely on the trusted agencies and not shoot from the hip because we're in a rush to create the standards, maybe at the local level first. I would also say, and this is just in conclusion, Cynthia, that it's so appropriate to have the right industry experts at the table when we are creating those standards. And that's something that NIST does very well. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see NIST calling Automation Alley, locally right here in Troy. How important is that? Because we've got this outpost here in southeastern Michigan connected to national and global partners that will be advising our preeminent standards body. So that's food for thought for me this morning, because now I want to say, let me put a marker down on that to make sure that actually happens.
Well, you can take a second and do that. No, that's thank you. That's perfect. One of the other things I've been thinking about is for years we've been hearing about, corporate policy for many years now has been to take a lot of manufacturing offshore. And the principle that I have heard espoused for a long time is that you take the manufacturing, the simple work offshore, and the R&D and the intellectual property stays back in the US. And over time, we've seen it doesn't quite stay that way. It fractures the supply chain. And it also tends to eventually the engineering and the R&D follow that manufacturing facility because of convenience. So we have lost a lot of that. Is there a feeling, do you have a sense that this will now draw some of that back towards us? That we begin to do a little more retrenching and reshoring, if you will, of not just the R&D, but the actual manufacturing to put it closer to home?
Look, this is a really great opportunity for us to continue to propel the Buy America agenda, the Make It in America agenda. As somebody who was working in the Obama administration during another kind of economic crisis in which we had to spend dollars to shore up the certain core assets of our nation's economy, as well as spend on recovery. One of the things that we saw in the Recovery Act was the limitations of what could actually be bought in America, what was actually made in America. As you may recall, there was a big push to do passenger rail car manufacturing here for high-speed rail. We found, though, that we didn't have one passenger rail car manufacturer for that type of high-speed rail left in the United States. So those dollars were sort of lost as a result. And some of the localities, there's a whole long story about what happened with high-speed rail, but I'll never forget being in a meeting and it being shared that there isn't a passenger rail car manufacturer left in the United States. And that's, by the way, the advanced manufacturing, the high intensity manufacturing, highly innovative type of manufacturing that we want here. You know, it's debatable the other types of manufacturing, if it's here or if it's not here. I think we want to have as much of it here as possible. I think we want to bring back the clothing and textile manufacturers. We all know why some manufacturing has been outsourced, right? It was the chase for the lower dollar, the lower labor costs, and on and on and on. Now what we've seen is higher costs, maybe some that have been sort of intangible, and also tied yet again, and this is what we've all always said about Make It in America. I mean, I've spent the last 12 years working on this, that this is a national security point for us. This is a point of national security that we need to be able to make, the required materials here. And even though we've got, look, a nice global economy, we here in Michigan, you know this very well, Cynthia. I know for some of your partners at Automation Alley, that we are an export destination, that we make best-in-class product from a best-in-class workforce, and we sell it to the world. We sell it to, over 90% of a consumer base that really isn't even here in the United States, right? We want to be able to compete and sell in international markets. And if you look at how history, just short-term history, has been written here, we passed in December, almost at the last possible minute. And by the way, anyone who knows me knows I was pushing to do this a lot earlier, right? But we passed that North American trade deal. And now we have a renegotiated NAFTA, and we have a competitive framework as the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and so that we can compete effectively in these international markets. And I think that's going to be a real saving grace for us coming out of COVID-19. Certainly, as we look at other markets, in Europe and in Asia, and frankly, even in Africa, but really in Europe and Asia, we've got to look at what we're making there and make sure that we can make it here in the United States. I saw the reports right away in January about where masks were being made. You know, the masks that we needed to protect ourselves, you know, for our doctors and our nurses and even the general public. And they were being made in Wuhan, right? So this is a point of a lot of passion. And it needs to be done with the right manufacturing expertise at the table. Thank goodness, you know, what propelled me to run for Congress was our regional manufacturing sector, because you don't want to get into a space where you're implementing policy just because it sounds and feels good. It's got to have the manufacturers at the table and the recognition of how supply chains work so that we can resource, relocalize manufacturing in the best and most efficient and productive way possible, not only for our country's national security and the benefit of our people, but also for the benefit of jobs and the manufacturers who are going to rely on that good policy making.
Thank you. One of the things you allude to, there's the export business that we've done as Michigan, but also within Automation Alley. And our small export program has brought in $1.5 billion in exports, mostly to small to mid-sized companies. That's who goes on trade missions with us. And I've had the opportunity now to see firsthand companies go. I had just come back from India in early February, and in that particular trip, we took a first time out of the country, first time exporter who came back with a signed purchase order. There's something very exciting about that. And you realize he had a novel approach. India is a huge country. There's 1.3 billion people. There's a lot of manufacturing, a lot of technology, but to have a gentleman travel with us, his first time out of the country, his first trade mission, and come back with that purchase order it's really hard to describe how that feels to participate in that kind of thing. So that's when we see what you just talked about firsthand, that there is still this global recognition that some of the American-made products are the best in the world. We've done our cheerleading today. Haley and I have done the cheerleading for the state of Michigan here. But it's an important point. And right now, of course, you know, trade missions are suspended until we can start to travel again, but it's an exciting opportunity. And we're even looking at some virtual mechanisms to try to continue to provide a platform for our partners to be seen and let people know what they're interested in doing.
By the way, Cynthia, I'm drinking my water out of a coffee cup. So to all of our friends at Automation Alley, I'm staying hydrated with water out of a coffee cup and then a cup of coffee next to me. I got my cold brew in another cup next to me.
Well, I've got coffee getting cold here. It was to be cold brew. It started out as something else. You mentioned cybersecurity, and I have to go to that since you and I have done some work together on cybersecurity. And I have had thoughts as well about that regarding the COVID mitigation strategies. To what degree should we be concerned, or what's the next step, the point of the tip of the spear on the cybersecurity issue and how this going to help?
Look, we should absolutely continue to talk about cybersecurity and to work on cybersecurity. And also remember that we don't want to make perfect the enemy of the good here. Again, the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, it's certainly not the only agency that's working on cybersecurity throughout the federal government, but they are a key player, and they're going to be a key and consistent player for us as we look to adopt and advance open source platforms, which are one part of our solution making to COVID-19 and how we're getting in front of COVID-19. And it's certainly going to be, open source platforms are going to be one of the ways in which we get out of COVID-19. That's certainly going to be the technologies and the technological approach to getting out of this pandemic, right? Or whenever we're fully, at the place with the treatment and the vaccine, we're going to be using and still relying on open source platforms. And so cybersecurity has got to be there alongside. And it's this interesting balance. I think everyone has had a cyber attack, right? You've had your data breached. You've had that new credit card issued to you through no fault of your own. You've maybe seen yourself locked out of your email. Maybe your company has experienced a cyber attack. And that is very disturbing. And it's certainly an impediment to how we advance and propagate new platforms that are going to be so essential to us. And so we need to, we've even seen this with the Zooms, that the Zooms get infiltrated by a hacker that comes in and is, disrupting the Zoom with hate language. And it's very, very upsetting. And it's like, wait a minute. We now have seen Zoom as a platform proliferate at about the rate of 3,000% in just a couple of months. That's how many more people are using Zoom as a platform. I know I wasn't really using Zoom, right? But before COVID-19 hit, now I'm using it every day. And we're going to continue to rely on it, but we're also, right, going to continue to protect ourselves from bad actors. Some of these cyber attacks are anomalies. We know that they're I don't want to call them innocent, but they're disruptive for the moment, right? Like the infiltrator on your Zoom. Others are looking to gain access to your data for longer term damage. Then we've got to look at, who owns your data and how it's used. It's certainly not an issue of cybersecurity, but the aftermarket auto care groups will say, oh my gosh, we've got all this data streaming through cars. And now in order to fix the car, when people bring it to us, we need access to that data, except for the OEM owns it. And then the OEM says, well, can we give it to you? I don't know. And obviously car dealers have auto repair, but they rely on the aftermarket auto repair just as much as the consumer does, right? They don't have the capacity to do every car repair, nor do I think their business model. I mean, maybe there's something I'm missing, but I don't think they're seeking to do that. That's just another tangible example of, look, how we get access to data and how it's utilized properly. And certainly your car repair is not doing a cyber attack when trying to fix your car, but we've got to be very careful about how we define. And I will tell you this, Cynthia, we cannot move fast enough in this space. I should be having a hearing every other day about this. And this is such a great reminder of the mountain of work before us in order to get this right and to do it right. I ran for Congress for these very reasons, how to come up with the best solutions for cybersecurity and open source and how to do it right. And what we don't want to do is legislate for today what's going to damage us for tomorrow. And this is why we've got to look at sunset clauses. This is why we've got to look at reauthorizations. So, hey, let's pass a law and with the best intentions that's going to help us innovate and move forward and be protected from cybersecurity attacks. But let's say it's got to be reauthorized every 18 months because of how quickly, Moore's law, how quickly IoT is developing.
That's a fabulous way to look at it. And the sunset clauses do need to be much shorter than we've often seen. That 18-month cycle, you're right, with Moore's law is something we have to take a look at because we're seeing the rapid changes, and I see it across the sectors from every industry, every factory I'm in. I have a last question for you. I'll give you the last word on this. Industry 4.0 is about being resilient and agile. So as we come out of COVID-19 and we re-engage with work, how do we come out stronger and better than ever? That's really what we want to do. That's what you want to do for Michigan. It's what I want to do for Michigan. It's what I want to do for the US and the degree that we control that. How do we do that? How do we become resilient and agile?
Yeah, I would say we have so many lessons in recent history and in longer history to draw on for our region. And how we've been kicked down, we've been written off. You could link this back to not getting the World Fair, the World Expo, in the late 1800s. You can link this back to the civil rights movement and some of the, sort of as part of that time in history, but what Detroit lived through with race riots, right? And, the burning of Detroit and an exodus out of Detroit and, lots of decline that occurred in Detroit as a result of a bunch of socioeconomic factors. Then you can look at deindustrialization, what people like to say, oh, there's deindustrialization, some of the rapid changes that happened in manufacturing, the shuttering of plants that devastate communities, be it if your city is large as Detroit or even Wixom that lost in 2007, the Ford Lincoln plant. And then you can look at how we over and over and over again rebuilt, reimagine, and move forward. We have those sayings on our t-shirts or the signage, right? That one of them says Detroit versus everybody, and it's sort of like, hey, don't mess with us. Then there's Detroit hustles harder. That's another one that I think is really inspiring, that and it's very motivational, but it's so representative of who we are as a region, as a metro. We don't call ourselves just the suburbs of Detroit. No, we call ourselves Metro Detroit, that we are metro area of 4 million people that always best expectations, that keeps our heads down and keeps working no matter what we're working on. Again, who stood up to meet the industrial charge of COVID-19? Detroit did. The automakers did. The suppliers did. The automation alleys did. The thought leaders continuing to bring people together. And so with that, the supplemental slogan, I believe, is that Detroit always rises, that we rise when times are steady, and we certainly rise when times are tough. And that we've got a real framework, even though it's maybe not the codified pandemic framework, but we've got the framework through the commitment of our elected leaders, through the commitment of our community assets, and the ability that we maintain to never, ever, ever give up. So those are, my ringing notes of aspiration for us. And it's also existing in our facts. I mentioned Wixom, home to the Ford Lincoln plant that closed in 2007. Today, Wixom's a smaller community, just kind of tucked in with Novi, but right next to Novi. But you cannot buy a home in Wixom. They've got industrial parks there that have now been developed right across from where the old Ford Lincoln plant was, that are making incredible technologies, incredible parts components, doing things that make you think, wait a minute, am I in Wixom, Michigan or Silicon Valley? That's what's happening in southeastern Michigan. And look, we've got more questions to ask and answer, Cynthia. I will come back and do that with you again. Electric vehicles is also on people's mind. That's going to relate to the Industry 4.0 conversation. But these steady technologies that allow us to rise above, proliferate, and innovate, and what all of you represent at Automation Alley, that's what's going to carry us forward. So thank you so much.
Thank you for being here with us. If we could get our U.S. Congresswoman, that was a preemptive statement, our U.S. Congresswoman to have a tad more energy, that would really be exciting.
I haven't even taken a sip of the coffee yet, the cold brew.
Thank you for the passion. Thank you for the work. Thank you for your time today. And I will have you back soon. Thank you all for joining.